the inquiry into what the president did is irregular. What the president did is innocent, essentially. It is a normal exchange of information between whether heads of state or people at lower levels. What's irregular is the fact that Congress has seized upon this and the media has seized upon this, and by seeking to repeat over and over again that it constitutes a crime or it constitutes grounds for impeachment, they're using that kind of repetitive, repeating the same statement over and over again until people start to swallow it and accept it as true.
Just what is the basis for the, quote, impeachment inquiry into President Trump? In the eyes of former FBI agent and prosecutor Marc Ruskin, in what ways is the inquiry highly irregular? And how does the whistleblower complaint relate to Spygate and the upcoming Horowitz report? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Marc Ruskin, who wrote The Pretender, My Life Undercover for the FBI, after almost 3 decades at the agency. Marc Ruskin, it's really great to have you on American Thought Leaders.
My pleasure, Jan. Thank you for inviting me.
So Marc, you were with the FBI for 27 years, undercover, doing counterintelligence, then you became a prosecutor in Brooklyn, and now you're a professor of criminal justice at John Jay, which is pretty amazing. You've got a very broad range of experience here. I wanted to talk to you about Ukraine. I wanted to talk to you about impeachment, in quotes, and also about these DOJ investigations that are happening and potentially how these things interconnect.
Well, first I'd like to point out, speaking not just as a former FBI agent, but also as a legislative assistant, I worked for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Senate before I went to law school. So I have a perspective on this that might be a little unique in that I've seen it from every angle. With regard to the latest accusations against the president, I think first it's necessary to put them into perspective and to think that the whole concept of impeachment, as it's now being projected by primarily the Democrat Party, is essentially a goal in search of a vehicle. So since the president was elected, it seems that they've been seeking an impeachment and then seeking a vehicle that will take them towards an impeachment. And when one vehicle implodes, they now look for a substitute. The original primary one, of course, initiated with when the director Comey essentially betrayed his trust with the interview of the president, ultimately collapsed when the Mueller report was released. That led to a total disregard of the report and an attempt to pretend by the Democrat Party and the media that it had never existed, and shifted the focus now to another source to accomplish their goal. When essentially just a couple of weeks ago, the whistleblower complaint surfaced, it seemed that they were looking for a vacuous attempt to seek to further their indictment or impeachment procedures. The whistleblower, looking now at the release of the whistleblower's complaint, and the term whistleblower is being in and of itself misused here, I would suggest, because having worked with whistleblowers and knowing whistleblowers, I mean, when I was in the FBI, there was an agent, Mike German, who observed, he was a fellow undercover agent, top-notch agent, and he observed personally other agents, a supervisor and other agents, destroy some documents they had written and replace them with other documents. So based on his personal observations, he made complaints within the Bureau which were disregarded, and ultimately he became a quote-unquote whistleblower. Here we have a situation where there's no personal knowledge of the acts that are being accused, that the president is being accused of, but rather it's third hand or second hand. In legal terms, it's hearsay. It's when one has heard someone else talk of what someone else heard, which has no probative value in a court of law, and it shouldn't have any probative value before Congress or to the public at all. But, and additionally, if you read the accusation, and I just reread it this morning just to get focused on for our conversation today, I was struck by the fact that it actually reads like a supporting affidavit written by a prosecutor that's attached to a complaint in a criminal case, which makes me suspect that it was not written by just one person. I suspect it was written by a team of attorneys, probably prosecutors, working hand in hand with some officials who may have been attorneys or not, and who had secondhand knowledge. Because if you look at the language, repeatedly it refers to informed by numerous, multiple sources have informed me. Mm-hmm. And that really sounds, if you look at a criminal affidavit, it reads just like that. It'll be the case agent or the prosecutor will write, based on multiple confidential sources, X, Y, and Z occurred. And it sounds so close to such an affidavit that it seems beyond credulity that it could have been written by an individual alone, a mid-level CIA operative acting on his or her own behalf. So that just as a start makes me, the fact that the individual is not truly a whistleblower in the legal sense,
okay,
that that the complaint or is more like an affidavit, already give one pause, a reason to pause and examine more closely the content. Now looking at the content, the acts that the president is accused of are not in any way articulable as criminal acts. Keep in mind, what is the president not accused of in this complaint? He's not accused of asking the president of the Ukraine to close an investigation. He's not accused of telling or asking the president of the Ukraine to disregard acts which could constitute a crime. He's not asking anything that's corrupt in nature. What he's asking the president of the Ukraine to do is to conduct an investigation to see if a crime has been committed. What could be more natural or appropriate in the course of a conversation? As to whether or not this is unusual behavior, countries exchange information regarding criminal investigations on a routine basis at every level, whether it's the head of state level or the cabinet minister level or the functionary level. And I myself was involved with for many years. The 27 years I spent in the FBI, 20 years, as you mentioned, were as an undercover agent. But the other 7 years were as we called in the FBI a legal attaché or assistant legal attaché, which is an agent who is assigned to a U.S. embassy and whose purpose is to conduct liaison with the national police or the intelligence services of that country. So I had this position as a permanent employee in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where I worked in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Asunción. And on a temporary basis, I worked in Paris several times, in France, and in Madrid. And my job was to deal with people at my level, or higher level actually, because based due to the respect that is accorded to the FBI in other countries, I would often be working with the Attorney General of that country. In Paraguay, I worked frequently with the Attorney General La Torre of Paraguay and with the Chief of Police, of the National Police. And we exchanged information. I would ask them to provide information to assist us in conducting criminal investigations. They would ask us. I would transmit the requests back to the states and so forth. So, and this was done mostly pursuant to what are called MLATs. An MLAT is a mutual legal assistance treaty. And most countries, including the US and Ukraine, have MLATs between them which prescribe the methods and the scope that the exchange of information can take. So all of this is a lot of steam over nothing, basically, is a long way to get to that.
So basically the procedures you're saying are irregular or highly irregular, or what?
Well, I'm saying the inquiry into what the president did is irregular. What the president did is innocent, essentially, It is a normal exchange of information between whether it's heads of state or people at lower levels. What's irregular is the fact that Congress has seized upon this and the media has seized upon this, and by seeking to repeat over and over again that it constitutes a crime or it constitutes grounds for impeachment, they're using that kind of repetitive, repeating the same statement over and over again until people start to swallow it and accept it as true. But everything that's being done in terms of this inquiry for impeachment is irregular. The fact that there has not been a vote in the House on articles of impeachment or whether to proceed on articles of impeachment is highly irregular. If one looks at the impeachments that have occurred in the past, whether it's Clinton or Nixon or going back further in time, always the procedures which are prescribed for and contemplated in the Constitution are not being followed. So when Gerald Nadler, as head of the Judiciary Committee, announces that he's initiating a impeachment inquiry, he has no authority, he has no constitutional authority to initiate such an investigation. When Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, announces that the House will proceed with impeachment, she also has no authority to do so. So what is it why are they doing it in such a manner? Is it that they have contempt for the Constitution? Probably. But also, is it that they're just grandstanding, seeking headlines, knowing that what they're doing has no legal consequence, which it doesn't?
No, fascinating. But, okay, but during the phone call, and this is something people have mentioned, of course, you know, President Trump is talking about someone who is a potential, you know, competitor for the presidency, right? So does that change anything?
Yeah, I'll tell you my take on that. He's not asking that a case be invented against Biden's son. He's asking that the truth be uncovered. The primary motivation for the call, I suggest, is to discuss the corruption issues in the Ukraine, the progress that Ukraine is going to be making by appointing a new prosecutor, and the president's interest in, our president's interest in establishing a good relationship with the president of the Ukraine. There's a secondary motive, could be that Biden's candidacy would be weakened or undermined by such an investigation as a result of the implication of Biden's son as having essentially a no-show job for which he's not qualified as a vehicle for having access to the vice president. But those two motives can coexist, and the fact that there's a confluence of interest for the president in having both those motives furthered by the phone call does not negate the value of the call, nor does it implicate, have negative implications, I would suggest, on an ethical level as to what occurred. Certainly not a criminal level, and certainly not on a level which would arise to a constitutional level for impeachment. Remember that the bar has been was set by the founders as high crimes and misdemeanors. So you have to, in order for there to be high crimes and misdemeanors, and I speak now both as a former prosecutor and a professor and agent, one has to be able to articulate facts which constitute a crime. And a crime is something which exists in statutes. The U.S. our system is essentially based on common law, but the reality is that most criminal law is statutory. So one has to be able to pick a statute, identify the elements of a crime, and then articulate what the president did that constitutes the elements of the crime which is he's being accused of, which would then subject him to high crimes and misdemeanor standard, and thus an impeachment. And to date, with all the certainty of Schiff and Pelosi, I have not heard one accuser articulate facts which constitute a crime. In the FBI, in order to initiate an investigation, the requirements, and these are requirements which have been promulgated by the Attorney General, they're called the Attorney General Guidelines, And first, an agent has to find enough facts to allow what's called the opening of what's called a preliminary investigation. And the preliminary investigation is to develop probable cause for initiating a real investigation and following up on a real investigation. And in this case, there are no facts with regard to Trump to even initiate a preliminary investigation. With regard to Biden's son, if the facts are that out of the blue he receives a position of employment where he's receiving, or his firm is receiving, $50,000 a month, which is more than the average salary of a citizen in the United States, or anybody in the United States, and certainly much more than anyone earns in Ukraine, probably 50 times what they would earn in a year in Ukraine, for a job for which that person has zero qualifications, doesn't even speak the language, and has never worked in that industry. I mean, I think you and I would love to have a job like that, but for some reason, I haven't been offered one. I've been retired a few years, and I'm still trying. So I would suggest that and then that individual just happens to be the son of the Vice President of the United States, who happens to be in charge of relations of foreign policy with that particular country. I think that would give you very few people would argue that that would not provide the grounds for a preliminary investigation. If people were looking at this objectively, in Washington, when I worked in Washington for Moynihan, both Republicans and Democrats did seem to have the ability to look objectively at different sets of facts. But the civil nature of discourse being what it is today, that seems to no longer be a feasible option, unfortunately.
So this is also very interesting. This is all happening with a backdrop of the Attorney General, William Barr, and John Durham actually being in Italy, from what we understand, and there's been a lot of, let's call it a media frenzy around that. What do you make of that situation?
Well, the mere fact that they've traveled to Europe in order to further an investigation, and that they haven't sent emissaries, that they didn't send Department of Justice prosecutors or FBI agents, although in all likelihood they're traveling with a team of FBI investigators and Department of Justice prosecutors, indicates that there is a high level of seriousness that's being accorded, and that they have already uncovered a great number of what we referred before to articulable facts, which could be used as evidence that something of a criminal nature has already occurred, and that they found that. Otherwise, they would, they're not going to Italy to go to the beach. I mean, it has to be in furtherance of an investigation which has already been determined to be serious in nature, and which dates way back before this incident with the quote-unquote whistleblower, which I would suggest is more of a diversion. Barr and Durham are on course for something that began at the end of 2016. And the fact that they're on course and staying the course is terrifying, I suggest, both to people in Congress, to people in the media, and to high-level officials in the Department of Justice and in the FBI who were involved with this from the start, including, and I would include in that former FBI Director Comey and Deputy Director, Acting Director McCabe, all of whom I think have a lot of exposure in this case and have a lot to worry about.
So, of course, the Epoch Times has been covering this whole realm of inquiry, right? Basically the spying on the Trump campaign and on the Trump presidency from that time. And I guess my question is, so you feel like this is connected? These two things are connected? Well,
they're connected insofar as there seems to be an attempt to divert attention first, initially, the media and many in the Democrat Party were seeking to discredit the Mueller report and to discredit Attorney General Barr. So when they couldn't substantiate their accusations against Trump. Remember, Representative Schiff, the head of the Intelligence Committee, who's I suggest a mediocre individual at best, and not someone of great talent or great intelligence, when he suggested that, when he stated rather over and over again that he had absolute proof that the president was involved in illegal acts with the Russians, that absolute proof has never materialized. The individual acting in such a manner, Director Comey, and his interview of President Trump, just trying to tie all this together. Remember, a lot of this started when Comey interviewed Trump and stated to the president, or president-elect at the time, that there was no investigation being conducted, and he was actually seeking to initiate an investigation. All these things, as the Epoch Times has reported in depth, are connected and are the direction that the AG and Durham are traveling in. And despite diversions, whether it's to attack Attorney General Barr for not immediately disclosing the full contents of the Mueller report. You remember that he was subpoenaed to come to Congress and bring the whole report with him, when they knew full well that if he were to bring the whole report with him, he'd be committing a crime. And the report contained grand jury material, Rule 5E material it's referred to, which cannot be disclosed without a court order. So for Nadler's committee to issue a subpoena to the Attorney General of the United States saying, bring this with you, knowing full well that if he complies with the subpoena, he's committing a crime, is essentially just grandstanding. So we have a pattern of behavior both within Congress and at the upper levels of the FBI, which will lead ultimately to some kind of, I suspect, some kind of serious prosecutions down the road. And all these, there's a whole matter with the whistleblower and so forth, I think will in a few weeks will be forgotten and will be replaced by some other diversionary tactic. But whether it succeeds or not, I suspect is unlikely.
Oh, that's very interesting. So speaking of this investigation into Trump, so to speak, you obviously have a lot of experience from working at the FBI and counterintelligence, right? What would make this counterintelligence investigation unusual, in your view?
Well, one thing which struck me, not to harp on the interview by Comey with Trump, but Comey was a prosecutor, a professional prosecutor, an assistant. He was a U.S. attorney and an assistant U.S. attorney, not an FBI agent. And I think when he interviewed Trump, he was utilizing a lower ethical standard than is used by FBI agents. I don't believe that an FBI agent would have conducted himself or herself in that manner. But Comey, acting in kind of a sneaky way, I suggest, was applying a lower standard of behavior.
Okay, so how so? Break that down for me.
Most FBI interviews, I mean, I'm not talking about an undercover trying to seek information by pretending to, but a face-to-face interview, generally the FBI agent will tell the person being interviewed, I'm an FBI agent, I'm investigating A, B, and C, and what can you tell me about it? And if the individual is a suspect, that individual may in fact even be given his Miranda warnings. Even though they're not legally required at that point, the FBI tends to err on the side of overcaution in terms of making sure that individuals are aware of their rights. Often, sad to say, prosecutors will not act with quite such a level of, and when, for example, over and over again, we see prosecutors withholding exculpatory information in criminal cases, and what's called Brady material. You know, the Supreme Court, as you know, has mandated that prosecutors turn over exculpatory information to defense attorneys. In the Mueller investigation, we saw example after example where Brady material, exculpatory material, was not being turned over to defense attorneys. And the greatest example is with the National Security Advisor, General Flynn, who first, not only was exculpatory material not turned over, but the interview itself was conducted in a highly irregular way. And then I think I should mention this as well. It was memorialized in a highly irregular way.
Okay.
I think it's worth going into, even if it's a little in the weeds.
Right.
The interview was conducted with a phone call, I believe it was by McCabe, first to Flynn, or Strzok, I'm trying to remember the deal, saying you're not going to need an attorney for this. This is among friends. Now, knowing full well that they knew full well they were targeting him for a criminal case. They knew the answers to the questions they were going to ask. They were going to look for any little diversion from what they knew to be the correct answer, whether it's I forgot or whatever, and use that as a basis of a criminal case, which they would then use to leverage him to cooperate, except of course he didn't have much to cooperate with. However, telling someone that they don't need an attorney is the opposite of fair play, and it's certainly the opposite of what the Supreme Court intended, whether it's in Brady and in the whole body of criminal defense law. Right. The way it was memorialized, the FBI requires FBI agents to write an investigatory report, what's called a 302, within the FBI, within 5 days of conducting the investigation. So 5 days after Flynn was interviewed, the agents who conducted the interview would ordinarily have written a report. One agent would have written the report, and it would have, at the bottom, would have said, on such and such date, agents Ruskin and Smith, interviewed such and so forth. And then there'd be the body. And if it's not done in 5 days, there has to be a reason. Now, we look at the 302s, which were released having to do with the investigation of Flynn, and they were written, 6 months, 9 months after the interview, and they were not drafted by the agents who interviewed Flynn. They were drafted by, I think, Peter Strzok and somebody else, or maybe just Strzok, and it's essentially Strzok writing that I was informed that by such and such that Flynn was interviewed, so it's not a direct.
Right.
So
it's almost hearsay, like you were discussing earlier.
And speaking as an FBI agent, in 27 years, and I've worked a lot of investigations with a lot of agents, I never heard ever of a 302 being written 6 months after the fact or 2 months after the fact, and certainly not being written by someone who was not present in the interview. That speaks to me. Now, when I saw, my initial thought was that this doesn't sound like the kind of thing I would have expected from Mueller, because Mueller, he had been director of the FBI when I was there. I had the honor of meeting him once when I was selected to work overseas. He interviewed anyone that was going to be representing the FBI overseas. He would interview them personally. So I did meet him on that one occasion. And I was shocked at such tactics, the failure to advise Flynn to have an attorney, the attempt to disarm him, combined with other tactics that we saw, police state type tactics that we observed, such as the arrests of Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, when arrests which could have been conducted with a phone call. I mean, in my experience in the FBI with white collar criminals accused of crimes which did not involve violence or
You don't typically get the SWAT team.
Right, no, they
okay.
typically,
Yeah.
there's a phone call to the attorney by the assistant U.S. attorney saying, we're arresting your client's just been indicted. Could you have him here in our offices surrender himself with you at 10 a.m. next Tuesday or whatever? And that's the way it's ordinarily conducted, not with a pre-dawn raid